Good evening. I still do not remember what I was going to tell Paul, so it'll come to me tonight probably, hopefully. Tonight, if you want, you can turn to Philippians chapter 4. That's where we'll be. Because it's the season, right? It's a festive season. It's a season of faith and friends and family, food and presents. It's a big part of this time of year. There are many things about this time of year that bring out the best in humans. You walk around, it seems like people are nicer than usual, maybe. At least it's been my experience. Feels like this time of year brings out some kind of magic in a lot of us. But there's also an old temptation that we humans face, maybe especially in this time of year, that it threatens to rear its ugly head in our lives. Because our society makes accumulation and collection and consumption a virtue. In other words, at least we can idolize stuff, that our stuff can become our God. Like Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, that their God is their belly. Our stuff can become our God. So we assume that more is better, that if I have more stuff, I'll be better, I'll be happier, the world will be as it should be, right? So we find our self-worth in our production and our consumption. Now what that looks like is at the end of the day, I look back over my day, I think about how productive I was, and that determines how valuable I feel. I don't know if you've had that experience, but I think a lot of us do. How much have I got done today? Well, that's how good I am today. Or maybe you look back over the course of the year, and you see how much you've consumed. You see what things you were able to buy, what advances you were able to make in life. And that's where you find your self-worth, that I am valuable because I now have this nicer car or this nicer house or whatever it is. But I see some dissonance between that mindset and the way of Jesus. Because Jesus says that you can't serve God and money. You got to choose one or the other. And he says that your life doesn't consist in the stuff that you have. And Matthew tells us that Jesus had nowhere to lay his head, that he was homeless. So given that, maybe all that's coincidental, but I think as his followers, we're called to take seriously those aspects of Jesus' life and his teaching, to think about how the way of Jesus might cut against the grain of our culture. Because climbing all of our ladders to nowhere, it doesn't seem to be making us happy, and it also doesn't seem to be producing peace and justice in our world. It doesn't seem to be bringing us back to the Garden of Eden, to the way that things were always supposed to be. Now, if we were going to put in one word this whole concept of more is better, we might call it consumerism. Just the mindset that the more that I have, the happier I will be. The better the stuff that I have is, the happier I will be. It's consumerism. It's what Dennis refers to as his mother's Bible, and I love that. For me, it's my father's Bible, the King James Version. It's what it calls covetousness, right? You remember that word? We don't use it all the time. But covetousness, you covet something. You covet anything. It's not so much about the thing that you want. It's about the heart that wants it, right? That's what covetousness is about. It's about something inside of me that says, if I have that thing, then I'll be worthwhile. Then I'll be accepted. Then I'll be cool, right? There's something inside of me that wants that. So tonight, we're talking about contentment in a season of consumerism. Contentment in a season of consumerism. We'll begin, and we'll talk about this, and the next time I preach, we'll span this topic. We have three headings to think through together. The first one is celebration is greater than cynicism. Celebration is greater than cynicism. So read verse 4 of Philippians 4 with me. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Now this is interesting because we normally think of rejoicing as something that wells up inside of us, right? That something happens in my life and it brings me joy. We think of happiness as, or in terms of, when this happens, I'm happy. When I am relaxing in a hot bath, then I am happy. Or when I'm hunting, then I'm happy, right? Or when I'm scrolling on Instagram and I have these adorable cat videos, then I'm happy. Okay, so we judge our happiness based on these external factors. And I think that's involved here, but there's also something deeper at play. He's calling us not only to that happiness, but to something deeper. Because notice, this is a command, right? He says, rejoice. That's an imperative. And in case you missed it the first time, he says it again. Rejoice, always. So this is a command. And I think that's because it's not necessarily contingent on what happens in our lives. It doesn't depend on my being in a hot bath. It doesn't depend on my hunting. It doesn't depend on me finding cute cat videos to laugh at. This is not reliant on that. That is something deeper inside of me. And not only inside of me, but also as a community. If you look at the beginning of this chapter, Paul is exhorting these two women in the church at Philippi to get along with one another. Apparently they're bickering, and Paul says, look, you got to get over it. So it's in that context that Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I'll say rejoice. There's something communal about this. It's about a church context. So we might say it's more about communal celebration than it is individual happiness. It's not so much about my happiness and rejoicing as it is a community celebrating God together. Now, this was something that was familiar to them in their culture. They had these great games and shows and festivals to celebrate their gods and their cities, to celebrate the things that were important to them. And that seems to be what Paul's calling for here, a celebration. We might say a party in celebration of our God, to rejoice in the Lord. But notice what he says next in verse 5. He says, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. So this is not the kind of party where you wake up the next morning and you don't remember what happened. Okay, that's not what Paul's calling for. He calls also for us to be reasonable. This is a weird word. There are elements in it of generosity. There are elements of weakness. There are elements of graciousness. So if you have, I'm reading from the English Standard Version tonight, but your translation, if you have a different one, probably uses a different word because it's tough to get this word right. But there's all of those elements involved. Maybe it's more about generosity. Maybe it's about reasonableness. Maybe it's about graciousness or gentleness. Something in that realm is what Paul's going for here. Just that your reasonableness, your gentleness would be known to the people around you. So, the rejoicing that Paul's talking about, it's not a fleeting moment of happiness, and it's not a wild party. It's somewhere in between. It's a choice. It's a choice to embrace the celebration of our God, of our city, of our church, of whatever it is, to embrace that celebration over cynicism. It's a choice to embrace the celebration. And this doesn't mean that we're blind to what's bad in the world. It doesn't mean that we shut away dissenting voices, because every system, in order to be healthy, needs disagreement, right? We can't grow unless we disagree with one another. So it's not about being blind to disagreements or to the darkness of our world. It's about the tenor of my life, the tenor of your life, the tenor of our life as a group of people. Are we celebratory or are we cynical? Because look at verse 8. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. Now, if you look at the headlines of our world, or if you read cultural commentators, maybe worst of all, if you go into a Reddit thread, some of you at least know what Reddit is. It is a cesspool of darkness, okay, where people go on there and express their most negative thoughts and feelings. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's a pretty dark place. It's a place of a lot of sarcasm, a place of a lot of bitterness. If you look at the news, if you look at Reddit, you'll see that we live in an age of negativity. We live in an age of sarcasm, of angst, that we're not happy with the way that our world is. So if you're looking at verse 8, you might reframe this to say that anything that is untrue or unholy or unjust or impure or ugly or of ill repute or vicious or blameworthy, that's what we hear, because that's what sells, right? That's what makes money, and so that's what we hear about. It's the opposite of what Paul is calling us to here. And we might say as well, that doesn't mean there's not a good reason for there to be negative thoughts and headlines. Of course there's good reason. There's bad stuff that's always happening in the world. And also, it's important to know about that stuff. So we don't want to just shut our minds off and ignore everything that's going on in our world just because it's negative. My point is that we can let all of that, cynicism, negativity, bitterness, we can let that affect our experience of life to the extent that we miss out on celebrating the good in God's world. We can miss out on celebrating the goodness of our Creator because we're so focused, we only feed our mind with the parts of our world that us humans have made ugly. That we can focus on cynicism over celebration. And I think this goes back to a story that we tell ourselves about the world. In short, and this is obviously an overgeneralization, but in short, the story can become that everything's on fire and I'm the only person who cares. That can become the story, right? That everything's on fire, the world's burning down, and I'm the only person who cares, or at least the only person who cares enough and knows enough to do anything about it. So I'm gonna post on social media and I'm gonna write to my senator, et cetera, because I have all the answers. And some of that can be helpful, right? But that story is what we're getting at. The story that everything is on fire and I'm the only one who can help or that cares. Or, on the other hand, let's say that we're watching TV and we see a commercial of a perfect, beautiful, kind, loving family or a perfect person. They're on this commercial. Or maybe you're at work and you just went on vacation, you get back and you're just talking about it, and someone comes up and they're just, oh, that's nothing. Just wait until you hear about my vacation, right? Or maybe I'm looking at where my life is right now, and I think about where I expected my life to be, and I feel like I've fallen behind. Maybe me of 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago, maybe they wouldn't have chosen where I'm at in life right now. And so whether it's my own expectations or the expectations of the people around me or the expectations of Instagram or TV commercials, I start comparing myself and I feel that I've fallen behind. And that story, that internal dialogue, whether it's conscious or subconscious, that story can determine how content I am, right? That can determine the happiness that I experience in life. These voices in our head that say that our country isn't what it used to be, that our church isn't what it used to be, or we haven't achieved what we expected to achieve, that I don't have what I used to have, that I've just gone down in life. These voices in our heads. I was thinking about this week, that the richest person in the entire world at one point slept on the floor and ate moldy food. But you know what? Probably still felt good about themselves because at least they had it better than the person in the cave next to them, right? That this is how we work. We function through comparison. Many of us, at least, we find our contentment tied in with our comparisons to say, am I better off than that person? Then I'm happy. Am I not? Then I'm not. It's all about that story. Now, the good news is that our perception is up to us. How we think about the world is up to us because we don't have to let that internal dialogue lead us to despair, to bitterness, to anger. We can choose to let the Spirit of God produce in our lives the fruits of love and joy and peace, patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and self-control. That we can choose to let that be the fruit of our souls. That we can choose to celebrate the fact that God is gracious and that we're created in His image and that He's making all things new, right? Revelation tells us that we can choose to rejoice in the Lord. Now here in verse 8, Paul says to think on these things. And this is a weird word. This Greek word is a weird word to choose. It doesn't make sense in terms of there are a few other words that would fit more smoothly in this writing. But Paul chooses this one, and I think the point is that he wants us to take this word and learn something from it. So it's usually tied in with negativity. This word is usually tied in, at least commonly tied in, with scheming to get revenge when something goes wrong. There's a negative bent in how this word is commonly used, especially in the Old Testament or the Greek Old Testament. So Paul takes this word with negative connotations, to think, to scheme up, to revenge, or to get revenge. And he turns it on its head. He turns it toward the noblest thoughts that we can imagine, whatever is true and just and praiseworthy. Think on that. I think this is what it looks like to truly believe that God is making all things new, that new creation is breaking into our world, and that you and I are a part of it. It's to choose, to celebrate, to rejoice in the Lord, to believe that God really is putting back together the broken pieces of our world in Christ Jesus. That we have this perspective that Jesus' resurrection has initiated a change in the fundamental fabric of reality. That's the tenor of my new life in Christ, that I focus on celebration over cynicism or complaining. Now, the second thing that I want us to think on, and we'll start this tonight and then we'll continue with the thought next time, is that presence is greater than presence. And this is, I don't know, this may be cliche, maybe this makes you laugh, but I think it's also true, and I want to talk about it with you. So look at the end of verse 5. The Lord is at hand. The Lord is at hand. So, for me, that can sound a little bit imposing. The Lord is at hand. And maybe partially that's because we don't normally talk like that, right? When Wendell walks into the room, I don't normally say, "Behold, Wendell is at hand," right? That's just not how we talk. Maybe we should try it, though. Sounds kind of fun. Yeah, if he wouldn't mind it. But this is not normally how we talk, right? It just means that he's nearby, he's close. The Lord is at hand. So maybe it's imposing because of that, but maybe it's also imposing because we can tend to think of God like an emperor, like an imperial emperor who is demanding of our lives. Or we can think of him as a harsh father who has expectations that we can never meet and who will never be happy with us because we'll never meet those expectations. That we can think of God in those terms. And what I think when someone is close to me really says a lot about how I feel about them, right? Or how I feel when someone comes close to me. Says a lot about how I think about them. So if I come up to you tonight afterward to talk to you and you feel anxiety, you feel anger, you feel dread, well, that says something about how you feel about me, right? That says that maybe I've conducted myself wrongly toward you in the past. And, you're allowed to be mad at me, but hopefully we can work on that too and grow together. But with God, we shouldn't feel that. And I think this is part of why I, at least as a kid, read this in a way that was imposing, that was distancing. Because when I thought of God being at hand, I thought of judgment. And I think the effect here is actually supposed to be the exact opposite. It's not supposed to be anxiety-inducing. It's supposed to be anxiety-relieving. And you can see that because of the very next words of Paul in verse 6. Do not be anxious about anything. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything. Now let's acknowledge that this is complicated, at least more complicated than we can make it seem in church, right? Because we can walk in here, we can choose to baptize our emotions, to pretend that they don't play a huge role in who we are and how we experience our lives, to pretend that we just have complete control over them at all times. That's not really how emotions work, right? So this is more complicated than we might like it to be. And there's a type of anxiety called acute anxiety that we feel when we're in danger. So if you roll over tonight or in the morning and you roll over in your bed and you open your eyes to experience a grand new morning and there's a grizzly bear that's standing over you and he looks really angry, you should feel anxious, right? You should experience some anxiety. That's a good thing, and it will hopefully help you survive. So there is that acute anxiety that is helpful. And there's also, I think it's really important to say, that we are all products of our own physiology, our bodily makeup, and also of our environments. So some of us, chemically speaking, are more inclined to be anxious, right? Some of us can't control that part of our lives. Also, if you've experienced traumatic events in your life, then you are going to feel the after effects of that, right? So we are all products of our bodies and of the things that we've experienced in life. So it's important to say that anxiety is complicated, and I'm not pretending to be an expert up here, but I want to give that caveat to say that this is more complicated than we can make it to seem. Also, one more layer to this, Paul himself talks in other places about anxieties that he feels. He doesn't say that all anxiety is bad. For his experience, he talks about being anxious about the churches. So we should care about the people in our lives, right? We should care about each other. And I don't know about you, but in my experience, literally everyone in my life has caused me anxiety at some point, including myself, mainly myself. I've caused myself anxiety more times than I can count, right? So that's part of being a human, dealing with each other, is that we have this experience. So it's maybe not as simple as we want it to be. We just want to bless the stress away. That's not how this works all the time. But some anxiety. Sometimes we feel this anxiety, and maybe it's a similar emotion to if that grizzly bear was standing over me, but there's no grizzly in sight. I might feel the same emotion. That type of anxiety sometimes is unhelpful and has a way of ruling our lives. It has a way of governing how I experience this world. So with that in mind, I want us to read the next words of Paul, because I want you to see what he calls us to do and how that impacts the complexities of our day-to-day anxieties. He says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. Now notice what he does here. He shifts the burden of responsibility off of you and me, right? Like if you're in a debate with someone or a dispute with someone, you want the burden of proof to be on them, right? You don't want to be under the microscope. You don't want to be having to prove your argument. You want them to be sweating. You want them to be trying to prove their argument, right? It's the burden of proof. It's on their shoulders, and they're sweating for it. That's what you want in a debate. It's also what you want in prayer. You want to be taking the burden off of your own shoulders and putting it on to God. And I think for myself, just speaking from personal experience, when I'm experiencing anxiety over school or work or family or grief or whatever it is, just too much coffee, whatever it is, a lot of the times I have found when I just step back for a moment and think, I realize that I'm taking all of the burden of my life, all the burden of my world onto my shoulders. The problem is I'm not built like Atlas, right? I can't carry the world on my shoulders. We're called to, as Peter says, to cast all of our anxieties on him because he cares for us. Now notice in 1 Peter that all of your anxieties, and here in Philippians, everything. We're called to cast everything onto him. This is a little bit of a side note, but I actually just taught recently. I was trying to remember where I said this. I think it was in a Wednesday night class with our guys, young adults and teen guys. I was talking about how maybe we shouldn't pray for the outcome of a football game, okay? So that was something I was teaching. And I say this from personal experience because I remember as a kid being a little bit too emotionally tied to the outcome of Alabama football games. I remember specifically one national championship game. I remember watching it at my grandmother's house. I went to the bathroom and prayed that we would win, okay? I just remember sitting there and praying. Now, that's my personal experience. Maybe I should have tried that to help us get into the playoff a week ago. Didn't think of it. Maybe that's what should have happened. But what I said in that class, and what I've heard other people say, and I've said it myself different points as well, is that maybe we should be careful about the things that we bring to God. And maybe there's some truth in that. But I think there's also truth, in correcting myself here, there's also truth in the idea that if it matters to me, it matters to God. Because notice, he says, in everything, right? In everything, let your requests be made known to him. And Peter says, all of your anxieties, cast them onto him. So I don't think it's maybe as simple as, if I pray that Alabama will get into the playoff, then they get into the playoff. Or that if I pray that we get this first down, that happens, right? I don't think it's that simple. I don't think God is directing the outcome of this football game. But I do think the very act of me as his child coming to him with something that genuinely matters to me, no matter how trivial it is, that very act can help to mold me into a person. That God can use that to help to mold me into the type of person he wants me to be. That he can mold me into a person that's reliant on him. That I'm not carrying the weight of my world on my shoulders because I'm not strong enough to do that. As a human-sized person, I am not strong enough to carry the weight of all of my anxieties and fears and dreads about the way that the world is. So, to pass it off onto God. Now, what happens? What does Paul say can happen when we do this? The next verse. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, notice he doesn't say that if I pray that Alabama's going to win, right? He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that all of our problems will go away. If I pray about a test and I don't study for that test, I'm probably going to fail, right? If I pray about some suffering, some pain that I'm experiencing, I'm probably not going to experience a miraculous healing right away. If I'm praying about, maybe you have an erratic family member and you're about to experience it because it's the holidays. If I'm praying about that person, they're probably not going to wake up tomorrow as an enlightened therapist and all their problems are better and so it's just easy, right? It's probably not going to happen. There's something deeper that's going on here. You may have heard of the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. This is the peace that Rome promised to the world. And the way that they did it, the way that they had peace on earth, was by conquering everyone who disagreed with them, or everyone who wasn't Roman got conquered. And that's how you had peace, because if you lose, then you play by our rules. And by playing by our rules, you're falling in line. We all have peace, as long as you don't disturb our rules and what we want, right? That's Pax Romana. It's peace by domination of your enemies. It's keeping the peace. But this peace is different. This peace actually keeps us. You see that here, right? It reverses that idea. Because it's not about me. It's not about me keeping this peace. It's about this peace keeping me. Because I'm not wise or powerful or patient enough to cultivate this heart within myself. But there's something deeper going on inside of me. Because notice the last three words here. In Christ Jesus. In Christ Jesus. That the spiritual air that I breathe, the water that I swim in, the most all-encompassing spiritual reality of my life is that I am in Christ. That I am one with Him and He is one with me, at least maybe in my best moments, that I am trying to be one with Him. And it's in that presence of God that I think we find peace. That we have the peace of God in Christ Jesus. But also, look at verse 9. We're wrapping this up. But verse 9, what you've learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So notice, not only the peace of God earlier on, but here in verse 9, the God of peace will be with you. We might say that if you get to know the one, you'll have the other. If you get to know the God of peace, then you'll have the peace of God. I want to leave you with this thought and a psalm. The thought is that there is never a moment where you or I will have to go without the presence of God. This is something that I think we maybe all know intellectually, but at least for me, in my lived experience, I tend to ignore that fact more than live within it. The idea that there is never a moment in which you or I have to live separately from God. That we all are living with Him and in Him in Christ. I want to close with Psalm 131. It's a short psalm, but I want to read it to you. Before we read it, I want us all to just take a breath and slow down and meditate on these words, these ancient words from our scriptures. My heart is not proud, Lord. My eyes are not haughty. I do not concern myself with great matters or things too wonderful for me. But I have calmed and quieted myself. I am like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child, I am content. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, both now and forevermore. So in this season of a lot of things, of craziness, of consumerism, of festivities, of celebrations, I hope that you and I can allow the Spirit of God to cultivate within us hearts of contentedness, that like a weaned child, I am content. Because we choose to embrace celebration over cynicism as God's people. And we also choose to embrace His presence over whatever presence this world has to offer, whatever stuff that's here on earth. That we find that in it, we can't find the fulfillment, the worthiness, the joy that we want. But in Him, we do. So, that's our thought for tonight. If you're not experiencing that, I hope that you'll give it a chance. If you haven't tried Jesus, if you haven't given your life to him, I hope you'll do it tonight. I hope you'll find that in him you can have this peace that passes all understanding. If that's something that you're interested in, that you want to take advantage of tonight, why don't you do it as we stand and sing together?